For those of you that don't know by now, this is the NERC CIP compliance workshop. And we're very excited to provide you with a fantastic selection of leading authorities on NERC CIP compliance. We have Gib Sorebo, who's currently leading the energy cybersecurity effort for SAIC and is one of the foremost authorities on energy security in the world. Mike Echols is currently managing the Critical Infrastructure Protection Program at Salt River Project, utility in Arizona, and he works closely with Gib Sorebo in sharing NERC CIP compliance information with others that are very eager to learn. Jim Brenton is currently coordinating the security efforts for ERCOT in Texas, and a large part of his job includes remaining up to date on all NERC CIP requirements for what is arguably one of the largest smart grid deployments in the world. Josh Axelrod recently joined Alert Enterprises Director of Professional Services. Came very highly recommended, I hear, from Michael Asante. After spending many years conducting NERC CIP compliance audits. And of course, Leo Frankel's company, Waterfall Security, provides a security solution that integrates with products within the ICS industry and serves to segregate critical infrastructure from external attacks while allowing higher visibility. And of course, Steve Applegate joins us from NERC. He's a Threat and Vulnerability Program Manager from NERC. It's always nice to have a NERC guy at a NERC CIP compliance workshop, isn't it? Very happy to have him, as we are with everyone else. Needless to say, his expertise on the topic of NERC CIP compliance comes straight from the source. Steve is going to discuss a topic I feel is even more important than NERC CIP compliance, which is security beyond compliance. So that should be very interesting. As I'm sure you all know by now, this is a real all-star cast. Please enjoy the presentation, and thank you for attending. And I hand this off to Gib Sorebo and Mike Echols.
Let me first start by saying that, these opinions that we're going to express aren't reflective of my company's opinions. It's simply what I believe, and it doesn't reflect in any way what we're doing at Salt River Project. I just have to make that disclaimer before we start. Some people in the room know why.
All right. Well, as Mike said, we're gonna start with talking about NERC CIP compliance and some thoughts about automating it, and then some grid operator perspective and a review in the Q&A. And as Mike originally also noted, the speakers getting down to some of the individual agenda, talking about, we're going to give you a little bit about what the framework is, and we're trying to, this is a smart grid security conference, and so we're trying to overlay that with smart grid as much as possible. It becomes challenging at times because Mike and I, Echols, did a webinar with similar topics to this, and because it was NERC CIP, we got a lot of people that were on there just, I got to pass NERC CIP, we got to do this, we got to do that. And when we started talking about smart grid, they were like, why are you talking about that? We want to know about NERC CIP. And so there's a little bit of a dichotomy among some of the people doing it that we're hopefully we'll be able to cover both sides, people that are interested in smart grid but want to know what are the potential implications both in the future as well as potentially now where it may come into play. And there's some theories about where NERC CIP may apply today in areas where it doesn't because of the implications of the smart grid. But also understand the grid as it stands today and where people may be impacted by NERC CIP, where they may be impacted in the future, regardless if they go with AMI or they go with substation automation or they go with any of the other new smart grid applications. So we'll try to cover that, and that's why we're covering some of the agenda items that we are in terms of defining a critical asset, what systems are a critical asset, applying NERC CIP, and so forth. Again, showing you the methodology, but also overlaying in with some of the concepts in smart grid. So with that, we're talking right now, and this is a slide, it's a few years old now, the DOE Modern Grid Strategy that was put together that sort of defined what a modern grid. I think it was before they even used the term smart grid, but it basically laid out what we've sort of been following through, and some of that has changed, and what goes in what category may vary somewhat. But, you know, we're all fairly familiar with the first concept of automated metering infrastructure, or advanced metering infrastructure, I'm sorry. And then demand response, which is typically associated with it, but obviously has tentacles into other aspects of the grid. When we talk about NERC CIP, that's an area that for now is not really, particularly the AMI part, is not necessarily associated with NERC CIP. There's some strained relationships that people are being able to tie to it that may eventually bring it in. And you know, eventually the thinking is that NERC CIP will apply to all parts of the grid. The interesting thing about smart grid in general is, of course, its goal is to link everything together. And if you see, and Mike will talk a little bit more in a little bit about, you know, some of the things that bring things into NERC CIP, and others on the panel will also do that. One of the things we realize with smart grid is that a lot of these things get tied together one way or the other, that it may send a message to another system, whether it's SCADA or you know, other aspects of a control center, generation, and so forth. And so it's going to be very interesting to see where that all ends up in terms of how these things tie together, because a lot of utilities have maintained the position about why NERC CIP does not apply to them by simply, you know, or apply to a particular set of assets by simply having those assets siloed or isolated from the ones that do. And there's a general thinking is that if you want to keep it that way, you better do that. I mean, one, you know, example was in some of the AMI people that implement AMI were thinking, you know, we've got all this fiber running everywhere for things like SCADA, going to substations, going to other parts of the grid operations. Why don't we use some of that for our backhaul to get our data back? And of course, immediately when they suggest that, people that are involved in that are saying, well, you know, you do that, and then NERC CIP may apply to AMI, or you're going to, you know, disrupt my operations, all these sorts of things, because a lot of people are comfortable with the idea that if you maintain things in somewhat of a siloed environment, number one, it's in their control. They don't have to, you know, worry about somebody else, you know, creating problems for them in terms of compliance, in terms of disruption. And, you know, it defines pretty clearly in their mind what they have to do to address whatever requirements they have to make. So it does become more of a challenge. Now, when we move outside of AMI, we start seeing more and more of this relationship to both NERC CIP and to, you know, the larger grid. The advanced distribution automation, optimization is about things like substation automation. Could involve a distribution substation, for example, that ties into a control center, that ties into transmission. And then, of course, you have transmission automation, automated transmission optimization, that really is obviously part of, you know, what is already covered under NERC CIP, things such as synchrophasers, other aspects of the transmission system that we already know are covered and have a clear relationship with the stability of the grid. A lot of the initial deployments obviously are on this AMI part, and you see on these arrows really is sort of also the timeline about when some of these take effect. And, you know, distribution and transmission, I'm not sure if those timelines are as accurate in relationship to each other, but certainly AMI we're seeing is one being out front because there's products, it's almost a turnkey solution in some cases, and so it's easier for that particular aspect to be rolled out. Asset management, the chart shows it as, you know, covering everything, and in some ways there's asset management going on now that may be less of a grid function and more of something of a one that wraps in everything else, but that's still part of it, and automating some of that, because, and that's again will tie into things like NERC CIP, because one of the requirements obviously is you need inventory, you need to know the current status of things and so forth. So so with that sort of context in mind, we want to talk now about NERC CIP and go a little bit of an overview, and I'll turn it over to Mike now to talk a little bit about the different elements of NERC CIP.
Okay, so, you know, I want to just start by saying that, you know, NERC CIP is NERC CIP is sort of like a foundational thing. You know, believe it or not, I'm a big fan of NERC CIP because it started the utility companies to at least think about cybersecurity. When I first started doing this, I worked for the Department of Energy, you know, one of the power market administrations, and we were thinking about security because we were the government, and we had to do NIST-based, we'd take a NIST-based approach to our SCADA system and things like that. As time went on, there was Urgent Action 1200 was out, but, there wasn't a lot of attention paid to it. As NERC CIP came along, things got a lot more serious because we had to, obviously get ready for this, potential audit that was coming sometime in the future. And that kind of seemed to really get the ball rolling. So, I know a lot of people bash NERC and, they think that, it's not enough, but, it's definitely started the process, and I think it's going to be the foundation on which smart grid cybersecurity is pretty much going to be founded on, not necessarily requirements, but the fact that, everybody's building off of those same programs. But let's talk a little bit about, the way this basically shakes out. CIP 2 is obviously, it's probably the most critical part of NERC CIP. I call it asset management, but what they're really trying to do, they're trying to figure out what is critical to the bulk electric system. It's important to understand that because we're talking about the bulk electric, we're not talking about, a hospital losing power or, a localized blackout in some neighborhood or something like that. We're talking about, the overall system and avoiding a major outage. That's a lot of the reason why NERC doesn't incorporate the, Gib was talking about the distribution assets and the AMI and all that kind of stuff because, really the big impact is going to be at the major generation and the bulk electric system or the major transmission stations and things like that. Not to say that you couldn't cause a problem at multiple, lower end entity or lower end facilities and create a bigger problem, but that's where NERC is basically focused. So they have a methodology for identifying or they have a recommended method for identifying what is critical based on a set of criteria that they've established in their guidance, and we'll go over that. And then, one of the things that I like to do when I'm going through this is to measure the impact of what we end up saying is critical. I think that's important to understand because that's the way that you can, basically measure risk, for your company or your organization. Then you've got CIP 3, which basically establishes I call it establishing your governance framework. It's really called security management controls, but it's where you write your initial policy that you're going to require NERC CIP to be required. You're also required in this standard to establish they call it leadership, but which really does put the organization structure in place to manage the NERC CIP program. Then they've got like an exceptions process, which is basically, your standard risk. It's sort of a risk process when you really get into the details, and we'll get into that this afternoon. You've got your, what I call CIP, then you've got your change control. One of the key other parts of this is the information protection standards, protecting the information associated with NERC CIP critical assets. That's sort of like your confidentiality, your confidential stamp label type thing, and controlling access to data. It's always a difficult thing in the IT world, and obviously in this world as well. Then you've got CIP 4, which I call personnel risk management. You're basically requiring training, making sure people understand security, doing background checks, and of course controlling access. CIP 5 is basically establishing the scope, and this is kind of one of these tricky things because in CIP 2, you're defining your critical assets and you're defining your critical cyber assets, but you're not really identifying, what the boundary is around those. You don't actually get to that until you get to CIP 5. And I'll talk a little bit about, the way NERC does implementation schedules, and, there's a certain sequence of activities depending on how you're declared to be a critical asset. They have a logical, I guess it's logical, it's a methodology on how they determine which standards got to be implemented before other standards, that sort of thing. CIP 6 is basically physical security and implementation of physical security controls. CIP 7, sort of the same thing, except it's system security controls. CIP 8 is incident response, how you're going to identify, contain, eradicate, and recover from different incidents, as well as, report them if you have to. And then CIP 9 is, basically, they call it recovery planning, but it's basically disaster recovery. So, that being said, I'm going to start to, this is kind of like the framework for this discussion in the next, over the next 45 minutes. Again, I'm going to go into detail about critical assets, how to identify critical assets, what they are, talk about critical cyber assets, how you identify them, the overall NERC CIP compliance framework, and then we're going to kind of inject cybersecurity processes throughout each part and, try to rationalize why we're doing some of this stuff. And this should be an open discussion, so if you have any questions, feel free to stop us during this. I don't know, Gib, if you want to have anything to add before we get started.
No, not at the moment. I think as Mike indicated, we want to keep this interactive. I mean, this is a workshop, and the goal is really to make sure that when you walk away from this, particularly if you have responsibilities around NERC CIP, that there are things that if you didn't know how to do, that you could do. That there's questions to ask. So anytime, don't wait for any question periods.
Okay, so, I mean, and you all have probably seen this. In the CIP 2 standard, the first standard basically requires you to develop a risk-based approach to identifying critical assets. We're talking version 3, not version 4, that is, I guess, the impending doom. I think you'll talk about it a little bit, Jim. We'll talk about version 4, okay. So this is kind of the way we do things today. Basically, the criteria says that, if you have a control center, a backup control center, a lot of people call it SCADA, that's sort of what it does, then that would be considered a critical asset, and you've got to define that as such. What that basically means is that, that your SCADA system is going to have to be evaluated to determine whether or not it has any critical cyber assets, which are the IT systems that support, supervisory control and data acquisition. Kind of transmission and I'm going to look at transmission substation, generation resources for the bulk electric system. Those two are, there's not really, but whereas control and backup control centers is, definitely you have it. You definitely know you have to evaluate it. It kind of gets tricky in the methodology for identifying what a transmission substation is that, supports, that will be a critical asset. I think in version 4, they've fine-tuned that a little bit and come up with this bright line methodology where I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's anything over 500 kV is critical, or? It depends, okay. But I know that's around like where the threshold's at. Bright fuzzy line. Bright fuzzy line, that's what they call it. And then generation resources, not a lot of people declared those in the past, but I think the new bright line is like 1,500 megawatts or something like that. So if the output is that, then it's critical. What these things are really for, or the reason that they're critical, what they're supposed to be critical for, in a transmission substation, because they are you're transmitting bulk power that is necessary for a region to get its power from probably some generation resource somewhere else. It's critical because without that transmission capability, you might not be able to provide adequate power to the whatever you're serving load to your distribution system or whatever. And then generation resource, the best analogy I could come up with was, contingency reserve. If I don't have 1,500 megawatts available and I can't get it from somewhere else, I'm probably going to have to shed load, which is going to create a problem. What that means is if my total capacity, if I'm, operating at, serving out 300 megawatts of load and I lose 1,500 megawatts of load, then that's going to be 1,500 megawatts of load that's not going to be available to customers, which means you're going to have a blackout. And that's sort of the theory behind that. Automatic load shedding, this is when you start to get into the smart grid aspect of it. Traditionally, you shed load as sort of, I don't want to call it a manual process, but somebody goes up and initiates that. I think, Josh, you can correct me if I'm wrong, automatic load shedding is where I'm going to program the computer to make the decision for me based on the conditions that the current status of the generation facilities.
Automatic load shedding these days, the way most systems are configured, you have under voltage, over voltage, and under frequency, over frequency conditions that are set up within the EMS. And when you hit certain levels like that, you'll have certain systems that you would shed load automatically.
Mm-hmm.
It's a ruthless, it goes after it, drop load.
Yeah.
But you're wanting to maintain frequency so you don't have a blackout condition, so you drop that load.
And what he's talking about is that, when you're in the EMS environment, you're monitoring, it's kind of the squiggly line that moves up and down, you got to keep within these ranges. If it ever exceeds over frequency or, goes under, then you have a problem and you got to do something about it. I'm not going to make a comment. Like, again, I can't talk about that. Nothing happened as far as I'm concerned. So.
The only thing I'll add is on this, a lot of people confuse automatic load shedding and special protection systems. What are the differences between the two? Right, so automatic load shedding is obviously to prevent voltage collapse, frequency drop, and subsequent load loss and collapse of the system. Special protection systems and schemes are designed to protect the equipment itself, right? And they're very different purposes, but sometimes they can lie within the same
agree. I know, at first I used to get confused by those two. Is why do they have two that are the same requirement? I didn't really understand it. When I started really looking at special protection schemes, you know, the utility industry understands anomaly detection. That's basically what this is. That they detect an anomaly and it does something about it automatically. Very sophisticated, very, I mean.
And of course, Smart Grid and AMI introduced another automatic load shedding concept, which is at the house or even at the actual load level, which is your pool pump, your thermostat in your house, whatever. And there's a lot of speculation, but no conclusion about how that falls into NERC CIP at the moment. In theory, maybe you are, but in theory, the idea is if you can from a customer information system initiate a load shed at an individual house-by-house basis, but do it 10,000 times or whatever it is, you may get up to that 300 megawatts. But Jim, you want to comment?
Well, no, we have three tiers that you have what's happening at the customer prem in the house, and you can go back up to like a neighborhood monitoring system, and back up to that into the EMS itself, where you're monitoring your neighborhood loads. And what you can do is you can jack in either the house, the neighborhood box, or into the control system. And normally you say, well, retail electric, using the Texas model, retail electric provider out there, you know, he's not involved in transmission or distribution or generation, and he's not going to be covered by NERC CIP. But if he gets up to the point where he can shed 300 megawatts of load, to me, that's just as important as somebody cutting off a generator. If you can drop 300 megawatts of load on me instantaneously, that causes me the same voltage and frequency excursions that I have to concern myself if somebody's dropping a generation.
And that's important. Oh.
So when you're talking about a distribution network, and you're automating a distribution network, and your distribution management system can drop 300 megawatt of load, you can't any longer say that this is not within the scope of NERC.
That's right, and that's how distribution actually.
Except CIP 2, as it stands right now, does not bring in distribution service providers as affected entities.
But
that's an issue that's probably going to be addressed going into version 5 of CIP.
it does end up affecting distribution. I mean, you end up getting audited in some aspect of distribution because the distribution, I mean, obviously the transmission system is dependent on the distribution, so there's that dependency there. And in some cases, if I have, and Josh, correct me if I'm wrong, if I can shed 300 megawatts of load in a common control area for the distribution system, then you are critical. You'll as you go through this methodology, you'll end up, that asset will end up being a critical asset.
Well, that goes back to registration issues.
Yeah, that's right.
The registration issues, you're registered, in Texas, you're registered within the Texas realm as a TDSP, Transmission Distribution Service Provider. And that would be a company like Encore, for example. They have both distribution and transmission. Now, for NERC purposes, some aspects of their company are registered transmission, others are distribution. And where that line falls, what's the scope of audit, those are the kinds of registration issues that the regional entities should be straightened out. I'm not sure what.
But I went to a EUCI conference a few months back, and just because a company is not registered in a certain way, from what I was told at this here conference, that doesn't relieve you of your obligation to comply with certain standards. If you have a facility that can affect the bulk of and whether or not you're registered, just because you're negligent in registering, you know, that doesn't mean you don't have to comply. You still have to comply.
See, I would advocate that's up to the general manager or the manager of the regional entity to go out there and say, I recognize they can shed 300 megawatts of load. They may not be registered as an entity, but we
But another place where distribution comes into scope is in their system restoration. Wherever the cranking path is out from the Black Start resource, that's usually what depends on what you're talking about, but there could be distribution substations in that path, and those systems would be critical. Now, all that's neither here nor there. You know, this is kind of like the criteria that NERC has developed so that they can put everybody in this little box and then have a clean, you know, it's easy to basically audit this, and they want to.
But it's not that clean. That's why I'm bringing this up, because we have, I mean, there's a big debate within the corporation now, with generation, with distribution, with transmission. And there's a big debate right now as we automate and as we start automating distribution, and we're able to shed more load to our distribution network. Okay, where is that line now? Okay, what do we need to declare as critical assets and critical cyber assets on the distribution side, because the NERC doesn't speak to it?
Yeah, I totally, you know, is NERC critical asset methodology a perfect solution for identifying criticality? No. Is the new stuff in version 4? Not at all. But this is you know, the industry votes on these things, and this is basically the best they can get to get consensus at the same time. But you're absolutely right. It needs to go a lot further. We probably, I mean, I was in a conversation last night with somebody else, and we were talking about, you know, there needs to be like impact categorizations at every level, you know, so that you can identify what really is a high critical impact system, you know, what's moderate, what's low, what doesn't matter, what is, you know, national critical infrastructure. There's all those things.
Ever since the Energy Policy Act of 2005 was passed, which brought us into this mandatory enforceable standard, et cetera, there's been a big